Before that time.
The physics behind, for example,
another question.
the actual change of mass.
Under the ultimate question about
During
the
father's course of 7 years,
about
ethics and
the book was put together.
Welcome to the Scholars Chair. Tonight, a conversation with Dr. Ahmad, Director of the Minaret of Freedom Institute. Along with him is Muslim author Dawud Adur-Rahman. At Focus, Sharia, Islamic law, and the American Constitution. What are Muslims asking for when they call for Sharia? Is there a need to protect American law from the infiltration of Sharia? Our discussion will start right here in the Scholars Chair.
Let the conditions of inequality that we suffered under, when we are the oppressor, the dominant class, let's not impose that injustice on the others.
Anybody think that you could have a just system without giving women their rights?
Everyone has an opinion, and we sit around the marketplace and talk about opinion, but what is truth?
With the shareholder, their goal is similar to the business, to maximize profit.
That belief becomes a context for a development of knowledge.
Say physics is the DNA of technology because the rules for how you build new technology starts in physics.
Because Quran challenges the people. It's not only the people of the book, it challenges Muslims.
We say secular, they hear godless.
Right.
What was intended?
Watch the Scholars Chair every Monday night. Dawud Adur-Rahman, Dr. Ahmad, welcome to the Scholars Chair.
Thank you.
You have this incredible subject in front of us, and we've been dealing with Sharia for a long time, and we've got a lot of shots of Dr. John Esposito trying to explore this topic as well. We've been just kind of using his book as backdrop for this discussion. But I want to get your personal understanding of this topic. What are the origins and meaning of Sharia? Tell me what's your view, Dr. Ahmad.
Well, the word appears in the Quran, and its meaning literally is the path. In fact, literally the path to the water. It has become used as a synonym for Islamic law, and that has become the source of a lot of controversy. But from my perspective, the analogy between the Sharia and the Islamic jurisprudence, which is properly called fiqh, is the analogy between the laws of nature and scientific theories about the law of nature.
Yes.
For example, gravity, we know it exists. You have some kind of gut feeling for what it is, but what is it really? We turn to scientists to explain it, and they explain it, but their explanations have varied throughout history. To Aristotle, gravity was the tendency of everything to be at the center of the universe. To Newton, it was the mutual attractive force between any two objects in the universe. To Einstein, it's the shape of space. These explanations are very, very different from one another, and yet we're always talking about the same underlying reality of gravity. Well, I think that's the case with Sharia. Sharia, the path to the water, and we all know how important water is, especially for the desert peoples where the revelation first came. The path to the water is whatever it is, whatever God has decreed it to be, just like gravity is whatever God has decreed it to be.
Yes.
And the scholars attempt to understand it and articulate it as a form of guidance for people who want to get to the water. That's the fiqh, that's the jurisprudence. So it's the difference between a landscape and the map of the landscape. And the map of the landscape can change with time. The reality that it's trying to map, that's an eternal.
That's not a change. Great explanation. You accept it, and what is your personal definition?
Oh, I definitely accept it. I mean, I also start with the understanding that the term Sharia, for Muslims, of course, everything starts with the Quran, which is, for us, the revelation of Allah to mankind. And the concept of Sharia is introduced in the Quran within the context of the entire revelation and the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad. So I guess to answer your question, what is the origin of it and what does it mean? It starts with the Quran and the introduction of the term in the Quran and the context of the revelation of the Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And I would say that and when it comes to the meanings, you will get as many meanings of what that means, what the revelation means and what the life of the prophet means based on different people's understanding of their time, of their circumstance, of their situation. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so elusive is that there are Muslims and non-Muslims on every side of what the term Sharia means, both now and in the past. So it's hard to get your head around, and I think it's easy, therefore, for people to vilify that among other Islamic terms, and just the mere mention of the term can sort of bring a lot of fear because the images that are kind of juxtaposed on what Sharia presumably means for everybody is always something negative.
That is the reason why we're here. We're trying to educate our public to try to dissipate some of that fear and try to give them some basic principles of Sharia and also just show the distinction between Sharia as understood in the Quran, as expressed in the Quran, I should say, and Islamic law as it's been developing over some 1,400 some odd years. So tell us, what is Sharia in relationship to Islamic law, and are they the same thing? Dawud.
Well, I'll approach this not from a scholar's perspective. I mean, it really, I think that for the typical Muslim here in the United States, when you come into a masjid and you want to profess belief in Allah, you profess belief in Allah and the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad, and you believe in the Quran, and there are various articles of faith that you might accept. You're not going to be asked about your understanding of Sharia. I actually hear more about the concept of Sharia on the news and debated in Congress, and even as represented by certain fundamentalist churches than I actually do in the masjid. As I understand it, for people who want to make a distinction between kind of the overall spiritual understanding as in the Quran as a way or a path, a very well-lighted and an open road, which Sharia has that understanding and kind of limit it to certain ordinances that we call law. I guess you could make that distinction, but anybody who does that is by definition coming up with their understanding of Sharia and deciding that some parts of what's in the Quran or the life of the Prophet Muhammad is Sharia and some things are not. And that's even up for debate and discussion and probably changes from different time and different people. So
Islamic law, jurisprudence, fiqh, yes? Sharia, what is it? It's principles and...
I would say I kind of agree with the analogy that Ahmad gave, that it's that the principles are unchanging because they're fixed in the Quran and the life of the Prophet, but their interpretation and their implementation and how they should be applied, and then what someone feels confident enough to definitively say, and this is the Sharia, changes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Dr. Mani, I wanted to talk to you about what we were talking about a little bit earlier. I want you to kind of expand in that. What is the benefit of Sharia? You had talked about that it actually does, it is greater than Islamic law, and it doesn't change. So therefore, what meaning is it in a Muslim's life?
Because my understanding is that it's an abstraction. And you look at the word it's used in the Quran, it doesn't talk about specific codes or specific injunctions or punishments or anything. It's used as a notion of an abstraction. So again, going back to its literal meaning, the path to the well, I think that if you're going to use Sharia as a synonym for Islamic law, and obviously people do, that your understanding should be as the notion of rule of law itself. That's what's being talked about here. And as a Muslim, we have to believe in the notion that there is a principle of rule of law. Now, how that principle applies in particular situations, so that's where you get into the jurisprudence and things can get quite complicated and messy, but the same is true with anybody's notion of rule of law. Here in the United States, certainly a country that claims to believe in a rule of law, but what does that mean? We have a great debate going on now about the appointment of a member of the Supreme Court. Well, why is that so controversial? Because the question about what the practical consequences of the application of not even an abstract notion of rule of law, but the Constitution of the United States, a specific Constitution, written out, carefully deliberated over, what is that going to mean is going to be very much in contention, always has been.
I wanted to ask you, because there's a lot of people who are really concerned about this. Would Sharia as a concept be in contradiction with just the specific First Amendment, the notion of religious freedom? I'm just curious whether if someone was following the Quran and following the example of the Prophet Muhammad, would they be in contradiction to the First Amendment?
Well, absolutely not, although I'll explain why it doesn't and why people think it might.
Okay, good.
It doesn't because the First Amendment very clearly allows for freedom of religion in two respects: total freedom of practice of religion and the prohibition on a state establishment of religion. So that means that whatever your notion of Sharia is as a Muslim, or whatever as any member of any other religion you think is the right path to follow, that you're allowed to follow that path. Now, although you're subject to the civil laws that apply to everyone, the constitutional law has been fairly clearly established that the civil law can't abridge your freedom of religion, at least not without some state interest. And I would say without a compelling state interest, although that's debated now too. So there is no inherent problem with that. As a Muslim, I can obey my understanding of Islamic law under the Constitution, and in fact my right to do so is protected. The problem comes when people start talking about implementing Islamic law. What does that mean? Now, if you take a very simple, say, interpretation, you say, well, that just means I want to follow Islamic law. That's the implementation. I'm going to abide by it. I'm going to conduct my family relations by it. I'm going to conduct my business relations by it. That seems innocuous enough. But the fact is, and here it's the Muslims to blame, not the Islamophobes. The Muslims started it. There were political Muslims who wanted to acquire political power and justified their seeking for power on the grounds that they were going to implement the Sharia. But as I've tried to point out, implementing Sharia is as silly as implementing gravity. You don't implement gravity, you obey it. And the same thing is true of Sharia. So the fact that these were politically motivated people who were seeking power has understandably provoked a fear in some people who say, now wait a minute. So you say these Muslims are going to come over here and they're going to implement Sharia and they're going to impose Sharia law on the non-Muslims in the United States? Well, we can't have that, so we're going to pass local laws and introduce laws in Congress, to prevent it from happening. Well, clearly this is a misplaced reaction, but yet it is an understandable reaction when people use that kind of language.
Yes, I quite agree. One of the problems with understanding Sharia is the Muslim interpretation of it. Is there more than one interpretation of Sharia? And tell me about some of the things that you maybe have experienced. And
I haven't personally experienced, because once again, I am hard pressed to recall a conversation where I've gotten to a debate about Sharia. I mean, people might talk about, and my experience is that people talk more about Allah, the Quran, the Sunnah, or the example of the Prophet Muhammad. I mean, all these things make up the overarching Sharia. They're part of the entire revelation, they're part of the experience and the part of life of the Prophet Muhammad. But as I understand it, through history and time, and even now, different countries and different countries that will say that they are Islamic countries implement various aspects, and I'll say it this way, various aspects of what they understand to be in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet and say that this is their implementation of Sharia. So I think I've read where, like in Indonesia, and we were talking about this earlier, where in many countries that were under colonialism, they might follow a civil law that's based on their previous colonizer for most things, and then when it comes to personal affairs, they do some version of Sharia. A lot of times that's also very intertwined with the local customs anyway, you know, so there's always, and there always has been, always will be, there is today, Muslims on every side of the argument of Sharia and non-Muslims on every side of the argument of Sharia because, or the understanding, because the term itself is broad. I mean, it's in the Quran and I would say in the Quran and it's someone's or some people's understanding of the implementation of what they understand to be the revelation and the life of the Prophet that they're calling Sharia and what part of it they're calling Sharia. So it's...
Yes, I agree. It's filled with confusion. I want to kind of focus in on these two things that are challenging in the American imagination, and one of which is the notion of a one-man rule all of Islam, so to speak, and including threats to rule the West under the domination of Sharia. That's what is being perceived, and this notion of a caliphate in some majority Muslim countries, one man ruled. Let's not even talk about democracy. Democracy is an evil thing in some of the counter arguments in favor of some notion of Sharia or Islamic law. Is the Islamic law in and of itself, or the way it's perceived, in contradiction to American democracy? I'm going to just throw that on the table for you. Are we talking about one man rule? Are we talking about establishing a caliphate as is being
the whole point
promoted?
Of the principle of Sharia, as I said before, is rule of law,
right.
Not rule of man, let alone one man.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
If there's a problem between democracy and Islamic law, it's over the question about whether the people can invent law out of whole cloth in contradiction to the laws of God.
Right, right.
So let's take it one thing at a time. First off, the rule of one man. In the time of the Khulafa Rashidun, the righteous caliphs, there was one person who was the head of state, but that person was obligated to rule according to the law and not according to his own whims and will.
Right.
There was no more assertive character in Muslim history probably than Umar ibn Khattab. And when Umar was challenged on his interpretation of the law by an unnamed, unknown woman in the masjid, he conceded that she was right and he was wrong. When Abu Bakr became the first of the righteous caliphs, in his inauguration address, he said, "It's true I've been elected your commander, although I'm not the best of you. If I give you an order that is in accord with the Quran and the practice of the Prophet, then obey me. And if I give you an order that contradicts the Quran or the practice of the Prophet, correct me. Because truth is righteousness and falsehood is treason." So clearly he didn't think disobeying him constituted treason. Disobeying the law, falsehood to the law, that was treason. Now, so how does that differ from democracy? Well, democracy is a very complicated term, and the way we use it, we use it to mean many different things, some of them that contradict one another, okay? So insofar as democracy does mean rule of law, obviously it's not in contradiction to Islam. Insofar as it means that people get to elect their leaders, it's not in contradiction to Islam. Although it is in contradiction to Muslim practice in many countries of the world today, but that's a different question. Insofar as it means the protection of minority rights, it's not in contradiction to Islam, in which people...
Or women's rights.
Or women's rights, although again, that's going to be contested, and we'd have to get into a long discussion about that.
Well, but the Quran wouldn't.
But the Quran, no, the Quran absolutely does not. Now, so what is the problem with democracy? Again, some people who consider themselves to be Democrats believe that whatever the people say is right. If the people vote for it, or if their legislators vote for it, it's right. So if their legislators, if the people vote for slavery, it's right. If they vote for white supremacy, it's right. If you vote for, excluding people from the franchise, it's right. It seems contradictory to me, but that's beside the point. The point is this: there is a higher law. And for me, if democracy means that the people are given the maximum latitude to, number one, to control their own lives to the degree it doesn't interfere with others, we call that liberalism. That was part of classical Islam. That they have to be consulted in those things that affect the collectivity. That's called shura in Islam. It's in the Quran. It's mandated.
That's consensus.
So as long as we're not talking about the right of the people to repeal God's laws and to say, well, murder is okay if it's committed against people we don't like, then there's no problem.
Yes, and I think that the image that most Americans have with the idea of being governed by Sharia is part of the problem. In fact, one of the things that Dr. John Esposito at Georgetown mentioned, that the image that most Americans have is the image that they have of Al-Qaeda and the image they have of the Islamic State and ISIS and so forth, and the explosions of the Trade Center and all that. These are the images, and beheadings and in decapitating hands. The notion of abusing women and all this was the image of Sharia, and nobody wants that. And I don't think I know specifically that Muslims don't want that, but that's the image that America has. What do you think that we can do in the short time we have? What do you think that we can do to correct some of these images? Dawud, you're saying that your ideas of Sharia basically have been dictated by, some of your ideas have been dictated by media, and
I think the image, not my ideas of Sharia have not been dictated by media, but the media has certainly painted an image of Muslims and Sharia,
right.
And I think that you've. The book is very clear about that, and it was a very useful book. It's a nice reference to have, that the idea that most Americans have of Sharia are based on the overwhelming negative images of Muslims generally, and the concept of Sharia, and we'll add jihad together with ideas of amputations, decapitation, female genital mutilization, and every other uncivilized activity that you can place within that context.
Yes.
I think the only thing that can really, now, unfortunately, there are some people calling themselves Muslims who would agree with those positions. You know what I mean? So I think that to answer your question, the only thing that can be done is that books like the book that Dr. Esposito put out, shows like this, having regular conversations and trying to figure out ways to get other more balanced understandings of these concepts in the public realm are the only way to combat it, because the fact of the matter is there are different interpretations of Sharia, by Muslims and others that, change over time, and the only thing you can do is just kind of show a range of understandings. And I think one of the things for me is that one of the principles of Sharia, and this is embedded in the Quran and the life of the Prophet, is to work towards the common good, to think about the general well-being of a society, to honor your agreements, to seek peace and those kind of things. Those things are also a part of the Sharia. So I think if you want to think about it that way, so I think the more you can have these kind of conversations and get that kind of message out, it might combat some of the negative images which are overwhelming every other message that's out there.
Yeah, I agree. Apostate, tell me about the Islamic view of apostate, if there is an Islamic view of apostate, and does it agree or contradict or support the idea that we actually abuse someone if they decide to leave the religion of Islam?
Well, before I answer that question, can I answer the previous question?
Sure, right, go ahead.
Because, the question about how do we respond to the confusion, the liberally set confusion, well, the way you get rid of darkness is with light.
Right.
And so the answer is to show up where this is coming from and why it's coming and what the motivations are, and especially what the techniques are. Because what's happening is that people are taking the bad actions of a few Muslims, exaggerating how often it happens, There's a recent study that just came out that showed that a terrorist act by a Muslim is reported 100 times more often than a terrorist act by a white person.
Yes.
And I'm not here proposing that Muslim and white are opposites. It's just two categories, partly overlapping, but that's the way that the media propagates things. Number one. Number two, they then want to advocate that the actions of those few Muslims are the actions of most Muslims. And number three, that it's an action mandated by Islam. Now, all of these things are false. And therefore, in order to, to fight the darkness, you've got to bring that out into the light. Okay, now let's take as an example of this the question that you posed about apostasy. The Quran says, "La ikraha fid din," and that there be no coercion in religion. Now, everyone agrees that this means that you cannot force anyone to become a Muslim. But there are many Muslims, and here I have to admit many Muslims, who say, but it doesn't mean that once someone has become a Muslim that they can leave. Right. It's like a one-way freedom of contract. You can enter the contract, but you can't leave it. You can lock the door of your house, but you can't. You have to throw away the key. This is nonsense. On a number of grounds, not least of which is the meaning of the word deen, and la ikraha fid din, no coercion in religion. This word that I translate religion is one of three words in the Quran that can be translated as religion, but of the three, it's one that is a synonym of the word of justice. So it's talking about a just way of life. So when it says there should be no coercion in the deen, it doesn't mean no coercion in someone entering the religion. It means in the religion itself there is no aggression. You see?
Yes, yes.
All right? So that means that you can't force people to do things, and you can't force them to stay in the religion either. Now, to play devil's advocate, the rebuttal of that is to say, yes, but you see, we have a hadith. We have a hadith in which someone said, the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, if anyone changes his religion, he should be killed. Now, there are several problems with this hadith. Its genesis is dubious, its content contradicts the Quran, and even its meaning is subject to dispute. What does it mean, changing one's religion? Is he talking about someone who changes from one religion to another? In which case it would be forbidden for someone to become a Muslim, you'd have to kill him? Or does it mean changing the teachings of the religion and pretending that they are something other than they are? All right? So this is such, and unfortunately, though, the problem is that there are many, many Muslims who accept that apostasy is punishable by death.
The problem is, of course, is the way we're teaching the religion. Dawud, just before we leave, you have a Quranic verse that actually mentions Sharia. Would you share it with our audience? And you have mentioned that there was one that is mentioned very clearly about Sharia.
Yeah, there's, I think it's important to say that, and I'll read part of it. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And we have revealed to you, O Muhammad, the book and truth, confirming that which preceded it of the scripture and as a criterion over it. So judge between them by what Allah has revealed and do not follow their inclinations away from what has come to you of the truth. To each of you, we prescribed a law and a method. So for the sake of time, I'll stop there, is to say that the word Sharia, when it's used within the context of law, as I understand it in that context, is all people, or many people, are peoples of law and order, to your point, of law and order, and that many people are following a Sharia or a law or a methodology. But for Muslims, our final guidance is the Quran as we arbitrate and make judgments on things.
Perfect. Way to end the Scholars Chair. We've been talking to Dr. Ahmad and Dawud Adur-Rahman concerning Sharia, Islamic law, and the American Constitution. If you want to see more Scholars Chair, go online to read1, scholarschair.com. I am Khalil Shadid. Good night.
Amazing.